Why did you choose then the two Roosevelts, who I didn't actually know were cousins until I was reading this, to flesh out your historical survey of the important presidents?
Well, because I think both of them were transformative figures. I was trying to look at these moments when change occurs. From Lincoln until Theodore Roosevelt, you get a series of presidents, most people can't even name them, who, don't do that much because they're pretty constrained because of the divisions after the Civil War and because there's a great deal of concern about presidency being too powerful. Theodore Roosevelt, in a sense, reawakens the sleeping giant of the American presidency. And he does something. I think his goal, to start out where I think we've started with each of them, his goal, what he wants to achieve is he has two goals, right? He wants the country at home to become a more modern country, which means he wants it to be more advanced in the way it does things, more advanced in its infrastructure, more advanced in its learning, right? He believes in universities, for example, more advanced in its business practices, more advanced in its management of the land. He loved experts. He was the president who brought the most experts of any president to that time into his orbit. And he wanted the United States to be a world power. So he wanted us to be a player, not the world power, but a player in the world and more modern at home. And he believed that doing both of those things would, again, make America more a country of opportunity. Theodore Roosevelt, as a young boy, had watched Lincoln's casket come through New York, and Lincoln was his hero. And so he thought if Lincoln saved the Union in his time, Theodore Roosevelt was going to modernize the Union and make it a big global power. And he set out to do that with remarkable determination. He was very clear, and he used his personality. This is another thing he did. He created this kind of charismatic president. He was the first president to really actively campaign and to go out and, go visit different parts of the country, not to bring them together as Washington did, but to argue for his policies. And he invested in creating a modern Navy, invested in creating a modern foreign policy apparatus as we come to know it. And at home, he invested in a lot of progressive policies, bringing the federal government in, for example, for antitrust activities to break up what he called the trusts. These big companies, big corrupt companies, making them more responsive to the interests of different areas, instituting laws to limit the mistreatment of workers. He was pro-union as president. And of course, what he's probably most famous for, creating our national parks. His view was there should be national parks that every citizen should have access to for free, because a modern citizen is in a big city, and in a big city, it's polluted and you're not healthy. And so everyone, it's a very modern idea, right? Modern fitness. Everyone should go out to the parks and strengthen their body and then come back to work. You should be sound of body, sound of mind, and sound of work culture. It's a very modern way of thinking about these things. And he used the presidency to do all those things. And lo and behold, I think he accomplished quite a lot.
Well, I don't know what the president's attitudes were before Theodore Roosevelt with regard to modernism, but the second thing you mentioned, that one of his goals was for the United States to be a global power, sounds very distant from what the founding fathers had in mind. So just as we mentioned that Washington didn't have to deal with imperialism, he was much more concerned with domestic affairs. Is this the place where we have the major shift toward a global mindset?
Yes, I think so. And I think that's something there's a pretty good consensus among historians. And it's really important that it wasn't inevitable. There were a large number of Americans, maybe even more than a majority, who believed we should remain isolationist. Roosevelt was going against what was prevailing conventional wisdom. If he had not been president, we might not have become at that time the kind of global power that we became. He used the office, some could say, to drag the country into the rest of the world. For example, when Russia and Japan went to war in 1904, 1905, the Russo-Japanese War, he inserts himself as the mediator, brings them to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, negotiates a settlement that helps the United States get access, particularly to Japan. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the first American president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. But most Americans didn't actually care. He wasn't doing that because Americans sent him to Washington to do that. He was doing that because he believed the United States should now be a global player, as it had not been before.
Well, you said that he accomplished a great deal in the dimensions of modernism, globalism, and then the national parks. I'm happy about those. But are there serious criticisms of his presidency, like with Jackson, that might, at least for some historians, preclude our viewing him as extremely accomplished?
Yep. Yeah. So there's a whole group of historians who would argue that he creates excessive militarism in the United States. That we were a country before Theodore Roosevelt. Of course, we fought a big war. In the Civil War, we had fought other wars against Mexico and other things. We fought wars against Indians. So we were a violent country. But we had not gone to war internationally until 1898, when he was not president, but when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he made warfare more normal. He used this militaristic rhetoric and the beginnings of American, in particular, military intervention in the Caribbean, in places like Haiti, Dominican Republic, Cuba, things of that sort. That really starts with Theodore Roosevelt. There had been imperialists before, but he puts government power behind that. And then after he's in office, when he leaves office and then runs again, he's a strong advocate for the United States to get involved in World War I and really pushing the United States to be more involved. So some would argue that he was too militaristic. Some would argue he was sort of creating this image of this sort of masculine United States, that he was harming the interests of women and peace activists and others. So that's one criticism. Another criticism is that he made too much of this was being done by the president, and that it created the basis for an imperial presidency. Too much power to the president. He was bringing all these experts in and coming up with all these ideas, but who was he checking with? Right? The national parks are a good example. I mean, Congress could have stopped him, but he just went ahead and did this, right? So there's a lot of argument to be made about the misuse of power by Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, so the excessive militarism and the imperialism, I can see, would lead to similar criticisms that Jackson might endure from contemporary public opinion. So will historians judge whether or not, let's say, the globalism or the imperialism, the militarism, whether they're successful by checking over like the decades after economics data, GDP, I mean, this sort of thing, general happiness of the population? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, more of what we do is we look at, first of all, why he did this, what effects it had on the ground, and then we look at what grew out of it. What were the institutions that came out of it? So it's less judging success on happiness, it's more judging success on what it actually did, what effects did it have in different areas. So you could argue that Theodore Roosevelt's diplomacy in Russia and Japan prevented war there from spreading. And it looks like he was actually pretty effective at building new connections. The U.S. and Japan actually have reasonably good relations in this period. So those are positive things that come out of it. Babe Ruth goes to Japan, for example, and the Japanese start playing baseball and all these things, right?
That is that where it started?
Yes.
Huh.
So that's all there. But then if you're looking at the Caribbean, you'd say the opposite. I mean, the United States starts intervening more in places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti. And then you look at what happens in those countries. I mean, we don't need a happiness index to realize that these countries do not become better ordered democratic societies. And we're a part of the problem because we're constantly going in there and disrupting things. So that's where I think he's been legitimately criticized.